Canada just redrew the rules of its own sovereignty. Since taking office in the spring of 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney has been building something methodical, something Washington did not fully register until it was already operational. A five-pillar national sovereignty architecture. And the border piece, the last remaining piece, is now in place. Not announced with fanfare, not dropped in a single press conference. Built, funded, legislated, and locked in across five specific areas that simultaneously tighten Canadian control over every entry point in the country, redirect Canada's border infrastructure investment away from American integrated frameworks and toward Canadian-controlled systems, and establish, for the first time in a generation, a formal legislative basis that Canada's border management decisions will be made on the basis of Canadian national interest, not American security preference. And Trump did not take it quietly. The responses started across social media within hours of Carney's border moves becoming public. Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa makes a deal with China. On October 24, 2025, he posted on Truth Social that all trade negotiations with Canada were, quote, hereby terminated. Earlier, he had posted a doctored image of the American flag flying over Canadian soil. The language was apocalyptic, the tone was furious, and not one post contained a single concrete policy alternative to anything Carney had actually built. Not one. Hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what Canada has done to its sovereignty architecture over the past 12 months is the domestic and institutional complement to everything Carney has argued internationally. And the border piece closes the last remaining door through which Washington believed it still had meaningful leverage over Canadian sovereign decision-making. Let me fill you in on exactly what the new sovereignty strategy says, what it has actually funded, and why it matters so profoundly in the context of everything that has happened since Trump returned to the White House. For the better part of 3 decades, Canadian and American border management was deeply integrated. Not just physically, shared ports of entry, coordinated customs processing, aligned security screening protocols, but institutionally. The two countries operated under the Smart Border Declaration of December 2001, the Beyond the Border Action Plan of 2011, and the Regulatory Cooperation Council, frameworks that effectively synchronized Canadian border policy with American security priorities. When Washington identified a new threat category, Canadian border protocols adjusted accordingly. When Washington changed its screening procedures, Canadian entry requirements moved in parallel. When American law enforcement agencies requested cooperation on border surveillance, intelligence sharing, or entry monitoring, the Canadian response was almost automatic. The entire institutional architecture of the bilateral border relationship had been built on one foundational assumption: that Canadian and American security interests were identical, that the threats facing both nations were the same threats, and that managing them jointly was more efficient than managing them independently. Hit that subscribe button right now because you will not want to miss any of the coverage I release on this story. This is just the beginning. That assumption made sense when the relationship was genuinely cooperative and the security concerns were genuinely shared. It makes considerably less sense when the nation whose security preferences are shaping your border management is simultaneously imposing 25% tariffs on your steel, threatening 100% tariffs if you sign a trade agreement with China, posting doctored images of your flag being replaced by an American one, and publicly describing your country as a candidate for annexation as the 51st state. Carney's sovereignty strategy begins from exactly that observation. It says, with the calm precision that has become the signature of everything his government does, that Canadian border management must be grounded in Canadian threat assessments, Canadian risk analysis, and Canadian national interest, and that while Canada remains committed to cooperation with all international partners, including the United States, cooperation is a bilateral choice that requires mutual respect, not an institutional default that operates regardless of how the broader relationship is actually functioning. Now here is where the rubber meets the road. Because Carney's sovereignty architecture is not a philosophical statement about Canadian independence, it is a specific, funded, operationally detailed framework with concrete measures across 5 pillars that collectively represent the most significant restructuring of Canada's strategic autonomy in a generation. The first pillar is legislative and security sovereignty. In October 2025, Carney introduced Bill C-12, the Strengthening Canada's Immigration System and Borders Act, which his own government describes as the strongest border security legislation in Canadian history. It draws on earlier legislative work to combat transnational organized crime, interdict illegal fentanyl, crack down on money laundering, and dismantle criminal networks. But it goes beyond enforcement. It constructs new legal architecture for Canada to manage its borders on Canadian terms, under Canadian law, with Canadian enforcement priorities as the governing standard, not American classifications as the default input. Alongside the legislation, Carney committed to hiring 1,000 new Canada Border Services Agency officers, the most significant CBSA force expansion in years, and raised the CBSA recruit stipend from $125 to $525 per week, the first increase since 2005. He backed the full legislative package with a $1.3 billion border plan that funds new technology, new facilities, and expanded enforcement presence at every major air, land, rail, and marine port of entry across the country. The design intent is unambiguous. Canada must be able to manage its borders fully and independently, on Canadian terms, with Canadian resources, without structural dependency on American system access or American institutional cooperation. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. The second pillar is the entry policy reset. Canada's new border legislation includes a comprehensive review of the information sharing frameworks and bilateral entry protocols that currently synchronize Canadian decisions with American security classifications. The issue that landed in Parliament with the most force was this. For 2 decades, Canadian border officers have been operating under informal but deeply embedded protocols where American administrative watch lists influenced Canadian entry decisions. For individuals who had no Canadian criminal record, no Canadian security concern, and no legal basis for exclusion under Canadian law whatsoever. Bill C-12 gives Canada the tools to change that. The framework Carney articulated is precise. Canada will cooperate fully on genuine shared security threats. Canada will not accept the principle that an American administrative classification automatically overrides Canadian sovereign judgment on who enters Canadian territory. Canadian borders will be governed by Canadian law and Canadian assessment. That statement, which sounds almost self-evidently reasonable the first time you hear it, represents a profound departure from how the integrated border relationship has actually functioned for 20 years. Because it makes explicit what the integrated system had quietly assumed away, that Canada and the United States do not, in fact, always share the same definition of who constitutes a threat. The third pillar is Arctic and maritime sovereignty. While the Canada-US land border has received the majority of political attention in both countries, Canada has 3 other borders, the Arctic frontier, the Atlantic approaches, and the Pacific coastline, that have been systematically underinvested relative to their actual strategic significance. Carney's Budget 2025 launched a $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund over 4 years, specifically designed to build the dual-use infrastructure Canada needs to enforce and administer sovereignty across the Northwest Passage and the broader Arctic archipelago. That fund is part of a larger $6 billion 7-year Northern Infrastructure Commitment that covers new Coast Guard capacity, remote sensing and surveillance systems, dual-use transportation infrastructure, and permanent Canadian Forces forward operating locations in the High North, in regions where sovereignty assertions have historically been limited by the absence of the infrastructure needed to sustain them. The maritime investments extend to new inspection and enforcement capacity at Atlantic and Pacific ports, and new digital border management systems that give Canada real-time situational awareness over its maritime approaches, independent of American surveillance architecture. The Arctic dimension of this strategy carries the longest time horizon and the deepest strategic implications. Because the Arctic is becoming economically and militarily significant at a pace that nobody fully anticipated 2 decades ago, and Canada's Arctic sovereignty claims are only as credible as Canada's operational capacity to enforce them. The fourth pillar is the trade architecture redesign. This is the element most directly connected to Carney's broader economic sovereignty agenda, and the one that produced the most immediate international market reaction. In January 2026, Carney traveled to Beijing and forged a new Canada-China strategic partnership, a preliminary agreement covering electric vehicles, agricultural trade, and structured long-term bilateral cooperation. The response from Washington was instant and unambiguous. Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Canada makes a deal with China. Carney's government proceeded anyway. Because the trade border redesign is not primarily about China, it is about the fundamental reorientation of Canada's trade infrastructure to serve a diversified economic future. Right now, Canadian export infrastructure is overwhelmingly oriented toward the south, toward the land crossings, the rail connections, and the truck corridors that were built to service the American bilateral relationship. That orientation made complete sense when more than 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. It makes progressively less sense as Carney pursues his stated target of doubling Canada's non-US exports within the next decade. The reorientation requires new container capacity at Pacific and Atlantic ports, new rail connections linking inland production centers to coastal terminals, and new digital customs platforms built for multi-currency, multilingual trade documentation across the 50-plus bilateral relationships Canada is now actively building and managing. The border is being physically reoriented to match the trade policy reorientation. The infrastructure of commerce is following the direction of strategy. The fifth pillar is the defense industrial sovereignty dimension, the element of Carney's architecture that speaks most directly to Canada's long-term strategic independence rather than to trade flows and border management metrics. In February 2026, Carney launched Canada's first-ever defense industrial strategy. It is a Buy-Canadian defense procurement framework that commits $80 billion in defense spending over 5 years, prioritizing Canadian suppliers, Canadian workers, and Canadian-controlled supply chains. It explicitly mandates sovereign control of Canadian defense-related intellectual property. It is designed to methodically reduce the structural dependency on American defense systems and American industrial capacity that Carney himself said had lasted too long. He said directly that Canada had relied too heavily on the United States for protection and that the world had fundamentally changed. The strategy acknowledges honestly that the economic and industrial reorientation Canada is undertaking will create transition costs in communities, in industries, in supply chains that have been built over decades around the American bilateral relationship. That redirecting defense procurement and rebuilding sovereign industrial capacity will disrupt existing arrangements before the new arrangements fully mature. The commitment is to manage those communities through the transition, with workforce investment, industrial diversification funding, and the patient construction of the capacity that makes dependency, ultimately, a choice rather than an inherited condition. Now this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary. Because Trump's reaction to Canada's sovereignty architecture was not just politically intemperate, it was strategically revealing. In his Truth Social posts and public statements throughout 2025 and into 2026, Trump made 3 specific claims about Canada's direction that are worth examining carefully, because of what they reveal about Washington's remaining assumptions about how the bilateral relationship still functions. Claim number 1 was that Canada's sovereignty measures represent a threat to American national security because integrated border management is essential to stopping terrorism, drug trafficking, and illegal immigration. That claim would be more persuasive if it were not for the fact that Canada's record on all 3 of those concerns is considerably stronger than America's own. Canadian border security has not produced a major terrorism incident originating from Canadian territory in recent memory. Drug trafficking across the Canadian border, while a genuine concern, is dwarfed in scale by the flows across the southern American border that American policy has conspicuously failed to control. And illegal immigration into Canada has not become the defining political crisis that it has become in the United States. Carney's government did not need to make this argument publicly, because the documented facts make it automatically. Canada is not the source of America's border security challenges. It is a well-managed, democratic neighbor whose border security record speaks entirely for itself. Claim number 2 was that Canada's trade diversification, and specifically the China Partnership, was designed to facilitate the movement of Chinese goods into the United States through Canada, using the Canadian border as a backdoor for tariff evasion. This claim is revealing because it tells you exactly what Washington's mental model of the Canada-China framework actually is. Washington is not primarily concerned about the bilateral Canada-China relationship on its own terms. It is concerned about what that relationship means for American tariff architecture. The specific fear is that Canadian ports become transit points for Chinese goods that are processed or partially manufactured in Canada and then exported tariff-free to the United States under CUSMA rules of origin provisions. Carney addressed this directly and without drama. Canada's rules of origin enforcement is rigorous, is subject to the CUSMA verification mechanisms both nations agreed to, and will not be used to facilitate tariff circumvention for any third country's goods. Canada is not interested in becoming a tariff laundering facility. It is interested in building genuine bilateral trade relationships that serve Canadian interests. Those are two different things, and the conflation of them reveals considerably more about American anxiety than about Canadian intent. Claim number 3 was the one that landed hardest in Canadian political discourse. Trump claimed that Canada's sovereignty measures were proof that Carney was choosing enemies over friends, and that Canada was, in effect, building a wall against America. Carney's response, delivered with the same unhurried precision he brings to every exchange, was 3 sentences long. Canada is not building a wall. Canada is building a border. Every sovereign nation has one. The distinction between a wall, a barrier designed to exclude, and a border, an administered boundary that manages the lawful movement of people and goods, is not a subtle one. But its invocation in this context was precise and effective. The wall language comes from a political tradition that has used it to describe a specific kind of exclusionary barrier on a specific American border in a specific domestic political context. Applying it to Canada's investment in professional border management infrastructure and sovereign legislation is not a factual description, it is a political provocation. And responding to it with a factual distinction, rather than a political counter-provocation, is exactly the right strategic move for a government whose entire approach depends on maintaining the moral and factual high ground in every single exchange. The international reaction to Canada's sovereignty strategy has been broadly supportive, in the terms that matter most for its long-term success. Not enthusiastic diplomatic statements, but concrete strategic engagement with the substance of what Canada is building. European Union officials have actively engaged Canada on trade diversification frameworks and digital customs standards harmonization. The United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand have all reinforced bilateral alignment with Canada. In March 2026, Carney delivered a major address in Sydney, Australia, explicitly calling for middle powers, including Australia and Canada, to resist what he called subordination by larger powers, and to use their sovereignty actively in the current fractured international environment. His January 2026 Davos speech, Principled and Pragmatic, Canada's Path, was received by the World Economic Forum as a defining statement for middle powers navigating the collapse of the rules-based international order. The China Strategic Partnership, the one Trump threatened 100% tariffs over, is now generating structural trade engagement at the institutional level. The world is not reacting to Canada's sovereignty architecture as a provocative nationalist gesture. It is reacting to it as a sophisticated, credible, and consequential piece of national strategic planning that happens to carry significant implications for the broader international order. Here is what this means. At the level that defines Canada's position going forward, the sovereignty architecture is complete, or structurally, very nearly so. The financial and industrial architecture is in place. The defense industrial strategy, the Buy Canadian procurement mandate, the $80 billion defense investment commitment over 5 years. The supply chain architecture is in place. Arctic infrastructure, the critical minerals framework, pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity reasserted as a national priority, defense supply chains being repatriated. The trade architecture is in place. The China Strategic Partnership, the mandate to double non-US exports by 2035, the bilateral relationship building across 50-plus trading partners. And now the border architecture is in place. Bill C-12, the $1.3 billion border plan, 1,000 new CBSA officers, Arctic and maritime sovereignty investment, and the legislative reassertion that Canadian borders are governed by Canadian law, Canadian enforcement priorities, and Canadian national interest. Every door through which external pressure could be converted into internal economic or political vulnerability has been identified, addressed, and systematically closed. Not with hostility, not with walls. With legislation, investment, and the patient, deliberate construction of the sovereign capacity that makes dependency a choice rather than a structural necessity. So, here is where we stand. Carney's sovereignty strategy spans 5 pillars: legislative and security sovereignty through Bill C-12 and the $1.3 billion border plan, an entry policy reset asserting Canadian law governs Canadian borders, Arctic and maritime expansion funded through a $1 billion infrastructure fund, trade diversification infrastructure underpinned by the China Strategic Partnership and a 10-year export doubling mandate, and defense industrial sovereignty through Canada's first-ever defense industrial strategy. Trump responded with tariff threats, including a threat of 100% tariffs, a social media declaration that trade talks were terminated, and a doctored image of American sovereignty over Canadian soil. Zero concrete policy alternatives to anything Carney actually built. The architecture closes the last structural gap in Canada's sovereignty project. International partners, Europe, Asia, Australia, have engaged with technical seriousness rather than diplomatic theater. And the border, Canada's border, governed by Canadian law, managed by Canadian agencies, built with Canadian investment, serving Canadian national interest, is now, unambiguously, exactly that. Hit that subscribe button right now. If this story helped you understand the full significance of what Canada has built over the past 12 months, and why Trump's reaction reveals more about Washington's remaining anxieties than about any genuine flaw in Canadian policy, hit the like button. Leave a comment telling us what you think the next pressure point in this relationship looks like. And subscribe right now, because the architecture is nearly complete, but the story is not, and the next chapter is already forming.